Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top 5 deck lists for March 2023. Starting, of course, with the king or queen of the modern format, that being Izzet Murktide. Now, this is a deck that really hasn't lost its top spot much in the last year. If you go back and look at our top 5 deck lists throughout the last year, I think maybe 1 or 2 months, Murktide has been the dominant deck in the format. Really, ever since the banning of Larissa the Dream Den made Grixis Death Shadow a much worse variant of a tempo deck, Murktide has really become kind of the best deck in the format, bar none. It's a tempo deck, so it puts pressure on your opponent. It forces them to react to what you're doing. But against other aggressive decks or other aggressive strategies, it can kind of take the control role and really does either fairly well. It usually wants to play from ahead and does struggle in matchups where it plays from behind, but it can play from behind and does have the tools to do it. Obviously, you're pairing the best removal spells in the red colors with the cheapest disruption from the blue colors with Counterspell and Spell Pierce, and then backing that up with excellent threats like Dragon Razor's Chandler, Ragavan, Ledger Shredder, and of course the namesake Tard, Murktide Regent. Now the deck goes through many iterations, but mainly it's around the edges. How many Ledger Shredders are you playing? How many Murktide Regents are you playing? How many DRCs, if any, are being played in the deck? Are you adding other cantrips besides Consider an Expressive Iteration and Mishra's Bauble? Are you playing Blood Moon in the main deck? Are you playing Archmage's Charm? Are you playing an extra Spell Pierce? Are you trying Minor Misstep? Etc. Really, this deck excels at having options. It sees a lot of cards. Generally, what one deck would need to play 3 or 4 of, like a deck like say Burn, for instance, would have to play 3 cards on the sideboard to see it. Murktide can reliably see it with 2 copies because it just sees so many cards during the course of so many games. Reasons why it's hard to attack: obviously, it's kind of hard to beat a deck that can play a powerful 1-drop and back it up by disruption the rest of the game and kind of ride that to victory, a la Legacy Blue-Red Delver. There are decks that can beat it, and decks that can certainly give it problems, but it is still the king of the modern format, as it has been for much of 2022 and the early 2023. So, deck number 2, and this is probably where things get the most contentious, because anywhere between 2 and 5, 2 and 6, the format's so close together. While Murktide's probably far and away the most played deck and one of the best decks just overall in terms of power, Creativity is probably the most powerful deck in the format, but also has its own set of issues. There are decks that conceivably do more powerful things than it. Decks like Tron can do more powerful things. Decks like, combo decks, Reanimator has the potential to do what this deck does. But if you want a mix of power and consistency, this is probably the deck that is the most powerful of the top tier decks, just in terms of what it's objectively trying to do. Generally, you're trying to put copies of Archon of Cruelty in play and just kind of ride that to victory, but build around that. You're kind of playing this blue-red control deck that also happens to play Renin 6 and Fairy Time Raveler. Beyond that, you get to play the broken card Fable the Mirror Breaker, a card that sees a ton of play in pretty much every other format other than Legacy. So it sees a ton of play in Pioneer, Standard, etc. Leyline Binding is a powerful removal spell. And then, obviously, you get to run some of the cheap disruption that a deck like Murktide does with Spell Pierce, Bolt, and then obviously the ability of running 6 to take down and Teferi along with Leyline Binding to answer almost every annoying problematic permanent. The one thing the deck does poorly, it has a very painful, very clunky mana base. You're trying to play a mountain-based deck because of Dwarven Mind to have tokens to sack to your creativity. Overall, this opens you up more to things like Blood Moon and such, which is an option that Murktide has to play. And overall, this is a very powerful deck, but does have some consistency issues because of the mana base situation. But, if you want probably the most powerful pound for pound deck in the format, this might be the deck for you. Kind of bouncing around a little bit, and we're going to deck number 6. Now, this is a deck that has faded into obscurity at points, and that is Elementals / Omnath Control. Now, In the past, this deck was 80 card Yorion piles. Was very good at grinding. The only deck that could really go over the top of it, of the top decks, were really Creativity and Tron when it showed up. Although it's really kind of hard to call Tron a top 5, top 10 deck right now. But it was a deck that could go over the top of what this deck was doing, and it was definitely a deck card that it hated to see. Really the only differential between the Elementals versions historically and the 4-color Omnath control decks were like you were playing things like Counterspell and Jace and Teferi, whereas this deck is playing Risen Reef and Eldamari's Call and kind of those flex slots. You really build around the card Omnath Lotus of Creation. You use things like Solitude and Fury to buy you time in the early game. Leyline of Binding, Prismatic Ending serve very much the same purpose that they do, or similar cards like Bolt do in Creativity to buy you time to get your engine online. And then once you get this Risen Reef or Omnath engine going, you just kind of grind your opponents out of the game. In theory, this deck is supposed to hang with or beat decks like Murktide. It struggles with decks a little bit that go underneath of it. As you see, you're not doing a ton in the early turns unless you're evoking elementals. So decks like Burn and Hammer Time can be a little bit problematic if you don't have your early interaction, or you have a little bit of a clunky draw with your mana base. And obviously this deck is terrible at interacting with spell-based combo decks, but there really aren't a ton of those in the format right now. Really only a deck like Amulet Titan, and even then you have cards like Solitude and Leyline Binding to really kind of punish those openings. But that is deck number 6. It has kind of made a comeback in the hands largely of Respect the Cat and some other players that have been playing it, and largely on the back of including the card Elesh Norn in its list, just another powerful card that can shut down creatures coming into play, things like Primeval Titan, etc., and other elementals. Number 3 best deck in the format, and that is Rakdos Scam. Now this is a deck whose stock is very much up and down, much like the deck itself. Obviously, you try to cheat in an early elemental, either Fury or Grief, and then bring it back with either Feign Death or Undying Malice. You either double Thoughtseize your opponent and pressure them, or you just put a 4/4 double striker in play and try to ride that to victory. Otherwise, you're playing kind of a middling mid-range pile. Sure, you have powerful cards like Ragavan and Blood Moon. You have cards like Fable the Mirror Breaker and potentially Seasoned Pyromancer to kind of help with the wrong half of the deck problem. But, otherwise this is kind of the same thoroughfare you used to see in Jund. You have Thoughtseize and things like Dothy Voidwalker, Fable with the Mirror Breaker. And honestly, that particular game plan is a little less powerful in today's modern format. When you're staring down things like Creativity, 8/8 Murktides, etc., it's much more. The only reason the deck is really on the map is the scam openings, plus the other hate cards that players have to play around. That said, this deck does have a decent grinding plan. Can bring in things like Magus of the Moon, Obnixilis, and different things to bring in for different matchups, and does kind of play like Rakdos mid-range from Pioneer, but that the power of that kind of fades in a format like Modern, which is much deeper and much older than Pioneer. So you really rely on your explosive openings to give the deck its top 5 power. Number 4/number 5 is Rhinos. Now this comes in many shapes and sizes. You basically have the Teamer version with Blood Moon, or the 4-color version with Leyline Binding. This version is trying to hedge the bets and play a little bit of both. Now, you kind of start running into some creativity problems there with clunky mana base, etc. But, this deck is trying to put 8 power or 10 power in play on turn 3 and kind of ride that to victory. Otherwise, you're disrupting your opponent with things like Force of Negation, Fire, Ice, Dead Gone, all of which play around the Cascade mechanic, because these cards all cost 3 or more. And then Furies to disrupt card decks like Yawgmoth, etc., clean up your opponent's early Ragavans, etc., and Leyline of Binding kind of cleans up most of the other threats. Now this deck is not quite as good as grinding as some of the other decks on this list as Omnath or Creativity per se. It is more of a put my pressure into play, maybe recur it once or twice, and hope that you can't deal with all these Rhinos. If you can deal with all the Rhinos, or you just have a deck that just don't care about a bunch of 4/4s, well, you're generally pretty well set up against it. Or maybe you're something like Scam, and you put a 4/4 double striker into play, and you're at 2 life before you can get your Rhinos into play. kind of puts you in a little bit of a disadvantage. So the deck is not as powerful as some of the other decks in the format, but still does its thing very consistently. Has 8 to 9, maybe sometimes 10 Cascade spells in the deck, depending on if it's splashing into that white. And you have access to things like Blood Moon to help out against things like 4-color creativity and Omnath piles, as well as Amulet Titan. And despite the huge hype around Amulet and Atraxa, Old Faithful, Hammer Time is the number 5 deck in the format now. This deck takes a little bit of a hit when Amulet is kind of big in the format, because obviously that deck is largely doing a lot of the same things you're doing, trying to do the broken turn 3 thing, but also happens to pack a bunch of Besagers and Force of Vigors and such, etc. You know, not a good place for this deck to be, in addition to all the interactive decks with Solitudes and Furies and everything else. But that said, a skilled Hammer pile can still make it through. This deck still has a decent grindy plan with Urza Saga. Sure, it doesn't have Luris anymore, but that hasn't stopped it in the past, 8 to 10 months of being a relevant deck. So, of all the creature decks, this is probably the best one in the format. You still look at decks like Yawgmoth, Amulet Titan, Living End, other such decks that can kind of close in on the top 10, top 15 in the format. But this is a deck that, does the beatdown plan okay, has the equipment plan that just beats you to death. Sigarda's a Pure Steel Paladin makes equipping Hammer a breeze. Usually you can find your Hammer between, copies of Stoneforge Mystic, Urza Saga, and Hammer itself, as well as having access to other things if you really need to. And, you have the backup plans of Analysis and Caldera Complete. You have plenty of disruption for your opponent's disruption, things like Blacksmith Skill and Spell Pierce. And then sideboard, one of White's historic strengths has always been the power of its sideboard cards. And while that has kind of faded in the current meta, still very powerful overall to have access to things like Sanctifier and Back, Draenith Magistrate, etc. against a lot of what the format is doing. So, coming in at number 5, Mono White or Mono White Splashing Blue Hammer Time.